My name is Heather Anderson, and I can still hear the way my mother's voice clipped the air that afternoon, like a pair of scissors. We were in the attorney's conference room, sunlight catching on the polished table between us. Mr. Ross slid a thick check across to my sister Rebecca, the corners crisp, the numbers too large to process in one glance. 10 million, he said, his tone practiced. Rebecca's smile widened as she folded it neatly into her designer clutch. Then my parents turned to me, no warmth, no preamble, and my mother said, "Go earn your own." No one gasped. No one shifted in their chair. It was as if the sentence had been rehearsed. I felt my fingertips press into the armrest until the leather creaked. I didn't speak, not yet, because just as I was about to push my chair back and leave, Mr. Ross cleared his throat. His hand went into the inside pocket of his suit and pulled out a thin, weathered envelope. The handwriting on the front was instantly familiar, looped, steady strokes I'd traced as a child when my grandfather let me help him sign seed orders. "There's one more document," he said quietly. I saw Rebecca's smile falter. My mother's shoulders stiffen. My father's gaze dropped to the table. And in that second, I knew whatever was inside that envelope was about to change the entire room. The drive out to my grandfather's ranch took me along the same two-lane road I'd known since childhood, where the marsh grass leaned toward the wind and the air carried a tang of salt from the coast. I hadn't been here in over a year, not since the spring before he passed, and every mile felt heavier than the last. When the turnoff appeared, marked by the faded wooden sign that read Anderson Acres, my hands tightened on the wheel. The gravel crunched under my tires, a sound that used to mean home. Now it sounded like a warning. The house looked almost exactly the same, white paint peeling along the porch rail, magnolia trees bending just slightly east as if bowing to some invisible force. The wind chimes above the front steps stirred their hollow notes, falling into the stillness. I hesitated before knocking. When the door finally opened, my grandmother, Helen, stood framed in the dim hallway. Her arms were crossed, her jaw set like stone. So she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the space between us, "You finally decided to show up." Her words hit harder than I expected. "Grandma, what's going on? They told me you were too busy," she said. "That you didn't want to be bothered. That you had a new life." Her gaze didn't waver. "Your grandfather called for you, Heather. Every day at the end. He asked for you." I swallowed hard. "That's not true." I called. "I even came by in March. Rebecca was here. She said no one was home." Her brows drew together. "We were here. We were always here." The silence that followed pressed in on us. Then she turned and disappeared into the house without another word. I stepped inside, the air thicker than I remembered, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She returned with a worn leather notepad, the edges soft from years of use. "This is the number he kept calling," she said, handing it to me. I recognized my grandfather's handwriting, instantly blocky and neat, the kind that spoke of a lifetime of precision. But the number on the page wasn't mine. Not even close. "I've had the same number since college," I said, my voice low. "They told us you changed it, that you didn't want to be tracked down, that you were ashamed of us." Her hands trembled just slightly. "No," I said, stepping back toward the wall. "They lied to you. They cut me off from you on purpose." Her eyes closed for a long moment, and when she opened them again, there was a fire there I hadn't seen in years. Without another word, she walked into the kitchen, reached for the old rotary phone my grandfather refused to replace, and began dialing. "Margaret, Thomas." "Rebecca," she said into the receiver. "Here, now, and bring the lawyer. It can't wait." She hung up, then looked at me with a steadiness that made my chest tighten. "They're going to hear the truth, Heather. All of it." I sat at the small kitchen table, while Grandma moved around the room with deliberate steps, pulling out 2 mugs and setting water to boil. The table was the same one where my grandfather used to read the agricultural journals I mailed him, where he'd ask about my latest research, and never once make me feel like I was speaking a foreign language. From the next room, I heard the familiar groan of the screen door opening, followed by the slow echo of footsteps on the porch. Voices carried my mother's bright, practiced tone, my father's deeper, more controlled cadence, and Rebecca's impatient sigh. They didn't know I was here. Oh, it smells exactly the same in here. My mother said, a note of forced cheer in her voice. I thought this was already handled, my father added. Rebecca's heels tapped twice against the floor. Seriously, this couldn't wait until the estate was processed. Grandma's voice cut through, colder than I'd ever heard it. Please sit down. Mr. Ross is on his way. He'll be reading Walter's final instructions. The house went quiet, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. I pictured them in the front room, Rebecca probably scrolling through her phone, my mother smoothing her skirt, my father looking anywhere but at her. The front door opened again, and another set of footsteps crossed the floor, steady and measured. This won't take long, Mr. Ross said, but it must be done properly. That's my cue, Grandma called. Heather, come in now. When I stepped into the living room, 3 heads turned in unison. My mother's smile froze mid-curve. My father's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering near his temple. Rebecca's eyes went wide, her mouth parting like she'd forgotten her line. I kept my shoulders square, my chin level. The urge to fill the silence was strong, but I let it stretch. Let them feel it. Please have a seat, Mr. Ross said, gesturing to an armchair opposite theirs. I sat down slowly, aware of every shift in their posture. Whatever they thought today would be, it wasn't this. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the balance in the room tip not in their favor. Mr. Ross placed his briefcase on the coffee table, the brass clasps clicking open, with a sound that felt far too loud in the tense quiet. He pulled out a thick manila folder and adjusted his glasses. This, he began, is the last will and testament of Walter James Anderson, recorded and sealed per his request. Rebecca shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other, her heel bouncing. My mother leaned back, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. My father stared at a spot on the rug. To Rebecca Anderson, Mr. Sir Ross continued the sum of $10 million, as outlined in the financial accounts prepared before his passing. Rebecca's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And to Heather Anderson, he said, looking directly at me, the Anderson Agricultural Research Annex, located at 317 Laurel Creek Road, including all laboratory equipment, active research patents, and associated funding accounts. Additionally, the remainder of the estate financial holdings, stocks, and retirement funds shall be divided equally between both granddaughters. The words landed like a clean break in glass. Rebecca shot to her feet, her chair scraping back. What, he gave her the entire facility? That's insane! She turned sharply toward our parents. You told me, Rebecca, my father warned under his breath, but she ignored him. Mr. Ross raised a hand. There's more. From the folder he produced a folded piece of paper, edges softened from being handled. A personal letter to Heather, to be read aloud in the presence of the family. I caught the flicker in Rebecca's expression, something between contempt and unease. My mother's gaze dropped. Mr. Ross unfolded the page, carefully revealing my grandfather's handwriting, broad, confident, unmistakably his. To my dearest Heather, he began, his voice steady. If you're hearing this, I'm no longer by your side, but my faith in you remains stronger than ever. You were always the quiet one, the observer, the thinker. You built your own truth in a family that often refused to see it. You were never a mistake. You were the legacy I was proudest of. I felt my throat tighten, heat pricking the corners of my eyes. Across from me, Rebecca's arms folded, her chin tipping upward in defiance. Mr. Ross kept reading each sentence, drawing lines I had lived my whole life, but never seen written until now. And for the first time they had to hear them too. Mr. Ross's voice carried through the room, steady and unflinching, as he read the final lines. I cannot undo the harm caused by those who should have protected you, but I can give you a place where you never need to ask permission to be yourself. Build something there that outlasts every shadow they ever cast. When he folded the letter and placed it back on the table, the silence felt almost physical. I drew in a breath. I remember the science fair, I said, my voice low but steady. The one I won in 7th grade. Mom didn't come. She was at Rebecca's dress rehearsal. My mother's head snapped up, a protest forming, but I didn't give her the space. I came home with the trophy in my hands, and felt like I'd done something wrong just for being proud of it. "That's not fair," my father began. "What's not fair," I cut in, "is telling Grandma I didn't want to see her, giving Grandpa a fake phone number so I'd never get his messages. That's not distance. That's erasure." Rebecca let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, please! You disappeared for years!" I met her gaze. "No, I was cut off. You made sure of it." Her smile faltered, and for a moment there was nothing between us but the truth neither of us wanted to say aloud. Grandma's voice sliced through. "Enough. I believed you when you said Heather didn't care. I should have known better. I watched you turn away from her over and over, and I let it happen. No more." My mother's face drained of color. "Mother, don't!" I said no more. Grandma repeated, her tone like stone. "You've lived in this house on my trust, and you've broken it. Leave. All of you." The air shifted. Rebecca stood abruptly, grabbing her bag with jerky movements. My parents followed, murmuring about legal options, but none of them looked at me. The front door closed with a sound that felt final. I exhaled slowly, my pulse still hammering. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel like a place I had to survive. It felt like a place I could breathe. The next morning, I drove out to Laurel Creek Road with the keys Mr. Ross had placed in my hand before leaving the ranch. The directions led me past rows of pine and open pasture until a long, low building came into view. From the outside, it looked like a converted barn, weathered wood, siding, tin roof, catching the early light. But the sign above the double doors read Anderson Agricultural Research Annex. I hesitated before unlocking the door, half expecting dust and cobwebs. Instead, the hinges swung smoothly, and warm light poured in from a wall of glass panels along the east side. The inside took my breath. Workbenches gleamed under pendant lights. Stainless steel sinks lined one wall. Microscopes and centrifuges sat ready, each covered neatly in plastic sheeting. Shelves held unopened boxes, each labeled with my name in my grandfather's careful script. In the center of the main room stood a single wooden table. On it rested something I hadn't seen in nearly 15 years. A battered blue notebook, edges frayed pages, bulging with taped-in diagrams. My childhood science journal. I reached for it with both hands, my fingers tracing the faded cover. Inside were my messy sketches of honeybee hives, crop rotation charts, drawn in colored pencil, and notes from afternoons spent trailing my grandfather around the fields. He hadn't just left me a lab. He'd saved the part of me they'd spent years trying to dismiss. A sharp inhale broke the quiet. Tara and Micah, two graduate students I'd mentored during a fellowship, stood in the doorway, holding the spare keys Mr. Ross had given them. "You weren't kidding," Tara said, eyes wide as she stepped inside. Micah grinned. "This place is incredible. What's the plan?" I looked around, the scent of fresh lumber and polished steel filling the air. "We start small, one project at a time, but we start now." As we began peeling the plastic off equipment, the annex no longer felt like an inheritance. It felt like a promise, one my grandfather had made, knowing exactly what I would do with it, and I intended to prove him right. Within a month, the annex had gone from silent and pristine to buzzing with energy. The east wall was stacked with seed trays sprouting experimental varieties of lettuce and drought-resistant beans. Laptops hummed beside microscopes, their screens glowing with datasets we pored over late into the night. Tara handled the greenhouse systems with an instinct I trusted completely, while Micah kept the research logs meticulous, every entry time-stamped and cross-referenced. I split my time between field plots behind the annex and the lab, inside the scent of soil clinging to me long after I'd washed my hands. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the glass, I stood at the whiteboard, sketching out an irrigation model when Tara spoke up. "Have you thought about outreach, bringing in students?" I turned, marker in hand. "Students, yeah," she said. "Rural schools barely get exposure to this kind of work. We could run workshops here." The idea lodged in my mind instantly. I remembered what it felt like to be a quiet, curious kid, with more questions than anyone wanted to answer. Within weeks, we launched Young Innovators, inviting middle and high school students from surrounding towns. We started with 12. On their first day, they wandered through the annex, wide-eyed, touching everything like it might disappear if they blinked. One girl in particular caught my attention, amber 13 hair hanging in her face notebook clutched to her chest. During a break, she shyly handed it to me. Inside were pages of observations about bees she'd tracked in her backyard, complete with hand-drawn maps of flight patterns. "Did you actually read it?" she asked when I looked up. "Of course," I said, smiling. "This is brilliant." The way her eyes lit up felt like watching a spark catch. By the end of that first semester, young innovators had a waiting list. Parents drove in from hours away. The annex was no longer just my project. It was a living thing full of voices, laughter, and ideas that might outlast all of us. Some nights when the building was empty, I'd walk the rows of plants, listening to the hum of the grow lights. And I'd think about how far this was from that day in the attorney's office, how the people who had tried to erase me had accidentally handed me the one thing they couldn't control. It was a gray afternoon 3 years after the will reading when I saw the unfamiliar car pull into the gravel lot outside the annex. The engine idled for a moment before shutting off. Rebecca stepped out, and for a second I barely recognized her. Gone were the sharp heels and tailored dresses. She wore a navy coat too big for her frame, her hair pulled back, simply no makeup to hide the shadows under her eyes. She paused just inside the doorway, glancing up at the framed photo of Grandpa that hung above the reception desk. "He always knew who you were," she said quietly, even when I didn't. Especially when I didn't. I folded my arms, keeping my voice neutral. "Why are you here, Rebecca?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took in the hum of the lab, the rows of seedlings by the glass wall, the soft murmur of students working at a bench in the corner. "I'd like to see it," she said finally. "All of it. What you've built." I could have said no, but something in her tone, stripped of the old performance, made me nod. We walked the length of the annex together. I explained the irrigation models, showed her the greenhouses, introduced her to Tara and Micah. In the student wing, she lingered at the display wall lined with photos from young innovators. "They look confident," she said, tracing a finger along a frame. "They are," I replied. "We work hard to make sure they know their ideas matter." When we reached the community garden behind the annex, she stopped. Families were harvesting lettuce, children laughing near the compost bins, a father testing soil moisture with one of our kits. Rebecca's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I just wanted to see what he built for you and what you've built with it." We stood there in the quiet for a moment, the air cool and damp with the smell of turned earth. I didn't tell her I forgave her. I didn't tell her I didn't, but I let her stay as long as she wanted. 6 years have passed since the day in the attorney's office when my parents handed Rebecca a fortune and told me to go earn my own. I haven't spoken to them since. Sometimes their names surface in local business articles or on charity rosters, but I keep scrolling. Whatever they're building now has nothing to do with me. Rebecca and I speak only a few times a year. She comes back each summer to volunteer with young innovators, coaching students on how to present their work with clarity and confidence. The kids call her Coach R, and she seems to like it. She's never apologized with words, but she shows up, and maybe that's the only apology I'll ever get. The annex has grown beyond anything I imagined. What started as a single building is now a research campus with multiple labs, greenhouses, and trial fields stretching toward the horizon. Our drought-resistant seed varieties are being tested in communities across the South, and our youth program has expanded into 3 neighboring states. On my desk sits my grandfather's pocket watch, its brass-worn smooth, a tiny photo of me, at 10 years old, tucked inside. I keep it where the morning light catches it, spilling small circles across my research notes. Some days, I catch myself talking to him in the quiet, telling him about a student's breakthrough or how the crops are holding up in a dry spell. Standing at the far edge of the trial fields one evening, I looked back toward the annex. The glass walls glowed warm against the darkening sky, the laughter of students carrying through the air. They tried to make me invisible. Instead, they gave me the space to become undeniable. And every time the wind moves just right through the magnolias, I can almost hear his voice again. Write the things they don't understand. One day the world will. Now it does.